voters vote that way, just like they'll vote on anything long term. Nothing lives forever. Now, the new development base is something I wanted to point out to as well. I think we're going to see suddenly people developing new pieces of software. And at some of the large companies I've been a consultant for, the concept of clean room development is a cheap fix for anything, because you basically go, well, let's stop arguing about it, because here's a piece de novo, and I can prove that now I've done all the rules I've talked to you earlier about, has been done to this piece of code, and I can show that the people involved with it never saw this stuff ever in their life. And that is another element that I think we're in store for. We're going to see some fast movement on those grounds. That doesn't alleviate the problem, that mitigates some of the problem. And so keep it in perspective as this goes further. I thank you for being a very kind audience, and I'd love to take lots and lots of questions from you.
Well, it seems like every other week. It seems like every other week I come up with a brilliant idea for some new project. And sometimes I implement half of that project, sometimes I don't. Usually I intend to release it as an open source project. Very few of them actually come to that point. But one thing that is always potentially possible is that some company like Dolby, or although I don't work in that particular field, but some company has patented some process or algorithm or something that I totally unwittingly infringe upon. And although of course, I think most open software people will agree that that's evil for them to do so, they can come after me. And I'm just a guy with very little assets, and I can't afford to hire a lawyer to defend myself, or even if I have pro bono or something. But the thing is, what advice would you give for me to avoid that? Do I need to go through large amounts of research? I mean, do you, if you start a new project?
Well, look at it this way.
How much do I need to be worried about that?
First off, I'm not qualified to give any legal advice.
Of course not.
But that's the standard disclaimer. The point, though, you should think about is if you were doing this at a company, you might want to file patents or not file patents. But what part of your job responsibility is to know the state of the art of the field. And the extent of reasonable activity here you would expect for someone to do is to become acquainted so they were competent. And that's a very good job for any developer to do. For example, when you go to change the kernel scheduling algorithm of an operating system, there are hundreds of times people have played with scheduling algorithms. You can go and find 20 or 30 different kinds of references to this if you just walk over to any library. And you'll find that they have, there's been a lot of work done on what are good ones, what are bad ones, and what are the comparative elements of them. You can also, by the way, go and with the patent search on the web, very cost effectively, find out where some of these bears may lay. And it's not a lot of work, it's typically a few days worth of work. In my work as an engineer, and I have done this many times before I start work on a new piece of, on a new piece of technology, I would spend more time understanding what other people did with it first. So I didn't repeat their mistakes or not understand how this moment in time is different than their moment in time. For example, the relative speeds of the bus on a processor and the internals of a processor, that's something that's changing at a radical rate. So the innards are fantastically fast. The edge of the die is as slow as it's always been. And that's going to continue for a while. So that means that the algorithms that you use inside of the chip now have to optimize the number of fetches coming off of it. The guy who solved that problem 10 years ago didn't face that as an issue. He could fetch all the live long day because the processor on the inside could never really catch up. And so a lot of times you get your best ideas from understanding the state of the art. And one of the things that turns out to be very crucial for being able to explain yourself as a good engineer, whether it be in a legal setting or in a professional setting, is being able to answer those questions as to why this is a better algorithm for these reasons. And if you get to the point of being able to do that, you're doing the best job you can as an engineer in the first place. So it didn't cost you anything, because now, because you have the highly developed skills of being a good engineer, and people value what you've done, okay, you're already the subject matter expert on this area that will be trusted. And any superfluous claim that comes along as a result of your efforts, it will be very difficult for them to establish the same kind of scrutiny as you've done. So just by being a good engineer, that's your best defense, is what I'm trying to get at there. It just means that if you do open source, being sloppy about it is not a particularly helpful thing. Think of open source as having no difference than going out and selling a product as well. You still have to provide the same level of scrutiny. But if you're interested in the topic to begin with because you want to do the best job possible, it doesn't matter, because you wouldn't release something that was less than that to begin with. And so what I find is that the best people in this area never have a problem. And so why not just be the best?
I like your reaction to this. There's some very interesting patents out there. I think some patents are granted, my feeling, some patents are granted by people who really have no comprehension of what they are really doing. There's a company down in Redondo Beach that has a patent that says, I have an image or something, and I modify it so that the number of bits is reduced, and then I reverse that process on the other end to get the regular image back again, or something very close. And they have a patent on that. Now, anyone who compresses an image for transmission anywhere is owing them royalties. They are claiming. In fact, I think they're taking a few of the porn sites to court right now, because those are the guys that have the money, and it's always about the money. So they're taking them to court, trying to get money for their use of compression in the video.
There are actually a lot of people who are taking porn companies to task over a number of patents. And the interesting thing is that the porn companies are actually the worst ones in the world to try to do that to, because they've long fought off a lot of challenges to them on a civil and criminal basis.
So they understand how to handle courts.
So, yes, well, they've become very hard nuts
Yeah.
to crack after a while.
Well, my question really wasn't about the porn companies. It was about the certain patents up there.
Sure.
That are really so broad that just everyone's going to owe them royalty.
Well, there's always freak show kind of like patents that happen from time to time. That's because we live in a real world, and the real world has unfairness in it. And so really what your question is, how do we deal with unfairness?
Right.
If somebody has gotten away with something they really shouldn't have gotten.
That is my real question.
Right. And unfortunately, that means that you have to bring justice back into a line here. And justice is a difficult thing. That's why we have lawyers and judges to begin with. There is also patent appeals processes. There is prior art. You can object to patents. I think really what it is that we need to have more scrutiny of a lot of these things. And one of the good things that some of the free software work was done was challenging really bogus patents.
Right.
And I think that that more contributions to people to do things like that are the best way of being able to eliminate those kinds of riffraff items.
So you're saying those should be challenged?
Absolutely.
But that is a cost of doing business.
Yeah, it's definitely the cost of doing business. And the problem is that now we're getting into an area of the business model for open development and free software. Okay?
Right.
Because it does not go for free, because it costs you money. It costs a lot of money, a lot of effort for the skull sweat of people. It also costs a lot for people who use this software. They want to have a good engineered thing. Everybody wants to use something that runs smoothly. That's not going to be vanishing at any time soon. So we have another set of issues, and that is, how do we establish good business models even ones for people who don't necessarily want to be businessmen but want to contribute their software, their efforts in. I think, by the way, that a tax deduction for a lot of those developers is more than in line, because in the same way that we talk about the internet reducing the costs of the infrastructure because people are doing electronic transactions instead of driving places, I think that a lot of the infrastructure costs that are eliminated by free software should actually be realized. And nobody is arguing for that, and it's really kind of a silly thing.
How do you measure it?
Excuse me?
How do you measure it?
Well, you can monetize it in several ways. In particular, you can view where it has eliminated the cost of performing a similar operation by identifying where a download occurs and where the product is actually used. If the product goes into use in any way, shape, or form and has an average effectiveness as measured perhaps by somebody who does a review of the product, then you can monetize that quite nicely. It's a fairly simple model, but now I have to talk cost accounting. And what happens is you have this idea that everything has cost centers, and if you eliminate some of those cost centers, statistically on the average, that's a good enough measure to determine that it's actually reduced the overall cost of a grand infrastructure.
This is a Haas business school
That's a business school answer. And if you want, I'll talk to you about it later, but it is something that's recognized already by the IRS. I think it's simply, nobody's bothered to bring it up. Yes?
I'll go with something completely different.
Sure.
If open software is to replace the commercial stuff, then it seems to me we're going to have a lot more creativity. Most of what I see in open software tends to be copies of commercial software.
Absolutely.
Can you speak to that?
Oh, you're speaking my heart. That was one of the things that made me very sad. That made me go into business school, because I began to realize that it wasn't the product, it was how the product was used. And that a lot of this revolved around, because I saw so many wonderful things that never got used. And I wanted to figure out why, because I didn't want to waste any time doing anything more that wasn't used strongly by people. And really what it is I ran into a gentleman at the Jurassic Software. Was it Doug?